Hello friends! As you may know, the government of Canada has recently been dominated by a big scandal involving Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The scandal is so big, in fact, it has even made international news, which is pretty rare for a story involving Canadian politics. I apologize that it has taken me so long to get to this topic. I know a lot of you rely on me to tell you about Canadian politics, but I've been very busy with travel and stuff. But I must say, in the amount of time that has lapsed since this story first broke, I have gained a lot of opportunity to think about it in a more thoughtful way, meaning I can now hopefully summarize the story for you guys in a way that is a little bit more fair and hopefully neutral. Because ultimately this is one of those stories that's about looking at the same set of facts from different perspectives and reaching very different conclusions. This video is brought to you guys by my friends at Skillshare, the wonderful educational website. We will talk more about them in a bit. Okay, so let me tell you one way of looking at this big scandal story, which is sometimes called the LAV Scandal. There is this big Canadian company called SNC-Lavalin. It does infrastructure projects for governments all over the world, but also tends to bring scandal with it wherever it goes. The company has been consistently accused of only obtaining construction contracts through bribing government officials, usually in very crooked third world countries. Indeed, because of this, Lavalin is actually one of the most infamous engineering companies in the world. They received quite a harsh blacklist from the World Bank a few years ago. Whatever you do not do business with this company, is what the World Bank said. One of Lavalin's longtime clients was the dictatorship of Libya under Colonel Gaddafi. They got a lot of contracts to build things for that regime, and in exchange, the Lavalin people allegedly gave a lot of goodies to various Libyan political figures, including most infamously buying prostitutes for Gaddafi's son. In 2015, SNC-Lavalin was charged by Canadian authorities for various crimes relating to their conduct in Libya. They were accused of over $100 million worth of bribery and fraud of a foreign government. This wasn't the first time Lavalin had faced such charges, but over the last few years, Canada's anti-corruption laws have become a lot more strict and the punishments a lot more severe. If Lavalin was found guilty of the Libyan charges, they could potentially face a ban on any Canadian government contracts for 10 years, which would be a big blow to their business model. So obviously, Lavalin didn't want that, so they decided to lobby the administration of Prime Minister Trudeau to spare them from the charges, and they found a Prime Minister who was totally willing to play ball. Lavalin has made donations to Trudeau's political party in the past, even though it is technically against the law for corporations to make donations to Canadian political parties. And there are a lot of people who would say that the Canadian Liberal Party has a long history of serving Canadian corporate interests. What Lavalin wants is what they call a deferred prosecution agreement law, which is basically a kind of too big to fail law. It gives the government the power to spare large corporations from serious criminal prosecutions. Instead of forcing the corporation to face full charges in court, they can just do some sort of watered down, out of court mediated settlement thing, like maybe just a fine or something. So long story short, in 2018, Justin Trudeau does indeed pass a deferred prosecution agreement law, and he is all ready to use it to let SNC-Lavalin off the hook. But oh no, who is that standing in his way? Why, it is the single greatest hero in Canadian political history, Jody Wilson-Raybould. Jody Wilson-Raybould is the Attorney General of Canada, and as such, she is required to sign off on any use of the deferred prosecution agreement thing. And she says, no. She says, I see what you are trying to do here, Mr. Prime Minister, and I will have no part of it, because I, Jody Wilson-Raybould, am a supremely ethical and morally upstanding person who does not believe in bending Canadian law to allow crooked corporations to get off the hook for their crimes. Prime Minister Trudeau's people spend weeks trying to get her to crack, but she won't because she is too ethical. So this past January, Trudeau decides to fire her and install a more compliant Attorney General instead. And then in early February, this whole story breaks in the Globe and Mail.
Well, the Prime Minister is denying a Globe and Mail report saying former Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould refused a request from his office to help SNC-Lavalin avoid a criminal prosecution. The Quebec engineering giant was accused of paying millions of dollars in bribes to get government business in Libya. The Globe reports SNC-Lavalin repeatedly lobbied Trudeau's aides for a deal, and that his office leaned on Wilson-Raybould to negotiate a remediation agreement.
And it has been all scandal all the time in the Canadian press ever since. The mainstream Canadian news media has basically told the story in the way I just did, I would argue. They've certainly presented Jody Wilson-Raybould as like the shining hero. She has been getting incredibly good press in the media since this scandal first broke, with some people even suggesting that, Justin Trudeau should step down and she should become prime minister instead because she is clearly so much more ethical than he is. Her biggest moment in the spotlight to date was a couple of weeks ago when she gave testimony before the Parliamentary Justice Committee. She told a very vivid and compelling story about what it was like to be consistently pressured by the Prime Minister's people and how she stoically resisted it.
I was taught to always hold true to your core values and principles and to act with integrity. These are the teachings of my parents, my grandparents, and my community. I come from a long line of matriarchs, and I'm a truth teller.
Jody Wilson-Raybould is a uniquely attractive figure to a lot of Canadian progressives because she is the highest-ranking woman of color in Canadian political history. She is an Aboriginal woman from here in British Columbia, a former chief, in fact. A lot of the coverage has played up this idea that her strong sense of ethics is like a byproduct of her outsider status and a testament to the strong moral code of Canada's Native peoples, particularly in contrast to the uber-entitled child of white privilege that is Justin Trudeau. Let us now take a little break before I tell you the second way that we can understand this story. Sometimes taking a little break can be a good way to clear your mind. What do you like to do when you have a little bit of free time? I personally like to use the services of today's video sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is a website that gives you these little video classes that you can use to learn new skills. They can be minor skills like learning how to use layers in Photoshop, or something bigger like how to start a new business from scratch. Recently, I've been watching a lot of videos about marker illustration. I really like doing illustrations with these fancy alcohol markers, and Skillshare has a lot of great tutorials that can teach you all about how to shade and color and blend with them, which makes me want to spend a lot more time drawing, which is a good way to relax when I have free time. The first 500 people who sign up to Skillshare using the link in the thing below will get unlimited access to all 25,000 of their classes, absolutely free, for 2 months. This is a great way to see everything that the website has to offer, so don't delay, give Skillshare a try today. Okay, so did you enjoy that little break? And now let us rewind and tell the LAV scam story again from a slightly different perspective. There is an engineering firm called SNC-Lavalin that is one of Canada's most successful multinational corporations. It employs over 9,000 Canadians and has achieved tremendous success in countries all over the world. Now, it is true that they have had their controversies in the past, but this is to some degree inevitable when you do a lot of business in the developing world, where things like bribery are a much more entrenched part of the business and political culture. But in any case, in the early 2010s, Lavalin did a big corporate turnaround. They got rid of a ton of old employees associated with some of the scandals of the past and put in a new board of directors and a new management team, including 2 back-to-back non-Canadian CEOs committed to reform. But then in 2015, SNC-Lavalin was brought up on charges that it had engaged in fraud and bribery of the Gaddafi government in Libya nearly a decade ago. Charging a corporation with a crime is always somewhat controversial because a lot of people would argue that a corporation is not a person. A company does not break laws, certain people operating within that company do. Or, as the Lavalin people themselves put it, these charges relate to alleged reprehensible deeds by former employees who left the company long ago. If charges are appropriate, we believe that they would be correctly applied against the individuals in question and not the company. In any case, fearing for its future, SNC-Lavalin lobbied the Trudeau government to bring Canada's laws regarding corporate crimes in sync with the laws of other advanced Western democracies like the United States and Britain. In other countries, it is very common for corporations brought up on criminal charges to have access to some sort of outside of court mediated settlement process. This is of course a very common thing in every other sort of prosecution, so why not corporate prosecutions too? A mediated settlement would make particular sense in Lavalin's case, given the alternative is a potential 10-year ban on Canadian clients for actions that no one currently running the company had anything to do with. Prime Minister Trudeau was sensitive to this argument, but there was also another important angle in his mind. See, SNC-Lavalin is based in Quebec, and if there has been one cause that has consistently animated Justin Trudeau's political career over the years, it has been making the province of Quebec feel welcome and included in Canada. In fact, the very earliest political opinion we have footage of Justin Trudeau expressing is on this very issue.
The eldest son of former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau was sounding a bit like his father today. 18-year-old Justin Trudeau is now a student at a community college in Montreal.
Arguing the federal case at Collège Jean-Brébeuf today was the son of its most famous alumnus.
Le Canada ne chie pas sur le Québec.
Justin Trudeau and his team were lonely voices for the Confederation. Lonely and unpopular. The young Trudeau said he doesn't much care what his peers think of his views.
Everyone's got peer pressure at this age. I mean, there's pressure to smoke, there's pressure to do all sorts of stuff. And I've never been affected by peer pressure. Never.
Just as an aside, this is a very big part of Justin Trudeau's political philosophy that I notice the international press really tends to ignore, just because it's really difficult to appreciate if you're not from Canada. The international press always portrays Justin Trudeau as like this super social justice kind of guy, but a very big part of his political ideology has always been defined by loyalty to his father's vision of Canada. And that vision was one where Quebec was fully integrated into Canada's economy and government. So from this perspective, the SNC-Lavalin situation worried Trudeau from a few different angles. If Lavalin was found guilty, they might conclude that Canada's laws are just too contrary to their business interests and leave the country altogether. This would not only kill thousands of Canadian jobs, but rob Quebec of one of its biggest corporate success stories. I've heard it said that in Quebec, they sometimes call big successful Quebec corporations like SNC-Lavalin a fleuron, which means like something very precious and beautiful. Because of Quebec's long history as a very economically disadvantaged part of Canada, it is considered very psychologically important for the province to have a few corporate success stories. If Lavalin failed, by contrast, it could start a very negative chain reaction. The company's downfall would be blamed on Trudeau for not doing enough to save it, and by extension, Canada itself. The Quebecers would be so offended they might vote for the Separatist Party in the upcoming Quebec election, kicking out the pro-Canada Liberal government. They might even vote for the Separatist Party in the upcoming national election too. As a Prime Minister from Quebec, Trudeau felt he had a unique responsibility to prevent this from happening. He tried to bring this up to Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould. In fact, his people repeatedly brought up the Quebec angle and Quebec voters, but she just didn't care. In fact, she seemed kind of incredulous about it.
The Prime Minister again cited the potential loss of jobs and SNC moving. Then, to my surprise, the clerk started to make the case for the need for a DPA. He said, quote, "There is a board meeting on Thursday, September the 20th, with stockholders," end quote. Quote again, "They will likely be moving to London if this happens, and there is an election in Quebec soon," end quote. At that point, the Prime Minister jumped in, stressing that there is an election in Quebec, and that, quote, "I am an MP in Quebec, the member for Papineau," end quote. I was quite taken aback.
Now, at the same time all of this was happening, one of Trudeau's other important cabinet ministers resigned for reasons that have nothing to do with any of this. It was a completely personal decision on the minister's part, but it nevertheless came at an extremely bad time. The guy was the head of the Treasury Board, which is one of the most important jobs in a prime minister's cabinet. The abrupt nature of his resignation triggered this big game of musical chairs in cabinet, forcing Trudeau to quickly reassign his remaining ministers to different jobs. And one byproduct of this shuffle was that the job of Aboriginal Services Minister suddenly became open. And who better to fill that spot than the highest ranking Aboriginal person in Canadian political history, Jody Wilson-Raybould. In the long and troubled history of Canada's relationship with its Indigenous peoples, there has never once been an Aboriginal person placed in a position of such authority over the welfare of her own people. So Trudeau was like, I'll just move Jody over here and get someone else to be Attorney General. Well, Jody threw a big fit when she heard about this. Oh, you want me, an Indian woman, to run Canada's horrible, racist, colonialist Indian affairs bureaucracy? Do you have any idea how offensive that is? That's like asking Nelson Mandela to administer apartheid. So Trudeau had to back down and give her the only other job he still had open, which was Minister of Veterans Affairs. Unfortunately, there was really nothing in her background to suggest she would be any good at this job. This made it look like Trudeau was just shuffling her into some useless position to get her out of the way. She ended up quitting that job shortly after the scandal broke. But the whole inside drama of the cabinet shuffle wasn't really known when the LAV scam story first went public. It only became mainstream knowledge when Trudeau's top aide, Gerald Butts, gave his testimony before the Parliamentary Justice Committee a week after Jody Wilson-Raybould did.
The Prime Minister said, "I know it is not your dream job, but it is core to this government's mission." Minister Wilson-Raybould said, quote, "I feel I'm being shifted out of justice for other reasons." The Prime Minister replied that he was doing this shuffle because he had to, and because he thinks it's the best thing for the government and the country. He repeated that he wouldn't be doing it at all if it weren't for Minister Bryson's departure. He said, when you lose a team member, everyone else has to pitch in. The call concluded. Then Minister Wilson-Raybould did something I didn't expect. I had never seen anyone do it before in 13 shuffles over many years. The former Attorney General turned down a cabinet portfolio.
There is a third angle to this story as well, but it is a bit more complicated and technical. It basically views the whole scandal as being about a much more narrow procedural question, namely, how much independent power should the Attorney General of Canada have? Everyone agrees that Jody Wilson-Raybould and Justin Trudeau did not see eye to eye on the question as to whether or not SNC-Lavalin deserved to face full criminal prosecution. Technically speaking, the Attorney General has to sign off on any prosecutorial decisions that the government makes, but technically speaking, the Attorney General of Canada is also a politician appointed by the democratically elected Prime Minister of Canada to do his bidding. If you are of the belief that the Attorney General should serve as a check on the powers of the Prime Minister, then you will be inclined to sympathize with Jody Wilson-Raybould. She was appointed to be the guardian of the integrity of Canadian law, and Trudeau should have deferred to her judgment. But if you are inclined to believe that the Prime Minister should ultimately be the one in charge, then it is very easy to view her actions as basically insubordinate. If all this sounds familiar, it's because it's basically the same situation that President Trump had with his former Attorney General, Jeff Sessions. Or to use a more sensationalistic example, President Nixon and his entire Justice Department. Jody Wilson-Raybould even made this exact analogy during her testimony.
The clerk acknowledged that, but said that the Prime Minister does not have the power to do what he wants. All the tools are in my hands, he said. I said that I was having thoughts of the Saturday Night Massacre. The Saturday Night Massacre is something that's commonly referenced in and around former President Richard Nixon, when he, in the early 70s, asked his then Attorney General to dispense of a special prosecutor. The Attorney General said no and resigned.
A lot of legal experts argue that both Canada and the United States actually have a quite poorly designed Attorney General's office. It's basically in a constant state of conflict of interest because it is directly appointed by the person whom it is supposed to hold accountable. But anyway, the argument that the true outrage of the LAV scam affair was Trudeau disrespecting the Attorney General's independence is the perspective that Canada's two main opposition parties have taken. They don't want to be seen as being too hard on Lavalin, and by extension Quebec, for the same reasons that Trudeau doesn't want to be. So as a result, they've tried to make the debate about something much more narrow.
We are talking about the abuse of power. Justin Trudeau abusing the power of his office to interfere in our justice system, violating the principles of the independent judicial system and the supremacy of the rule of law. That is extremely dangerous.
This is unprecedented testimony that bolsters our argument and our call for a public inquiry. At this point, Canadians demand some answers to the questions that they have, and the only way to get to the bottom of this is a public inquiry that would have independence to assess the truth.
One of the weird byproducts of this is that it has turned Canada's opposition parties into real rah-rah cheerleaders for Jody Wilson-Raybould, even though she was previously understood to be one of the more partisan and frankly incompetent members of Trudeau's administration. The other weird thing is that it is still quite likely that even when everything is said and done, SNC-Lavalin will still not face full prosecution for the Libyan stuff, regardless of who the Prime Minister winds up being or what party is in power. Anyway, let me put this question to you. What is your perspective on everything you've heard? Do you think this is a legit scandal? And if so, what specific part of the story is most scandalous to you? There are certainly parts of the story that offend me, but I have to say, as the scandal continues to unfold, I gain greater and greater appreciation for just how complicated it is and how anyone who tells you that it's a very simple thing is just being dishonest. So this was my attempt at being honest with you. Thank you so much for watching. Do not forget to like and subscribe. Don't forget about that great Skillshare deal either, and I will see you all next week.